Shalom and welcome to the Jewish Geography Podcast. I'm your host, Rabbi Eitan Levy. I'm a tour guide and teacher in Israel. Today's episode is about boundary issues. That is, what are issues which are beyond the pale? When is it legitimate to exclude certain ideas from the Jewish conversation? Not in a throwing people in jail sort of sense, but in a, not inviting them to talk at our events kind of sense. We're going to talk about the Open Hillel movement and the advisability of including Arab-Jewish love stories in the Israeli high school curriculum. This one's going to be a wild ride, so buckle up. Now on with the show. I was involved recently in a discussion on Facebook with some very liberal religious Jews, and the discussion veered off into talking about Open Hillel. Now, Hillel is a Jewish campus life organization in North America, really the Jewish campus organization, funded by private donors, basically, older rich Jews, which aims to provide community and services for Jews on campus. Now, in places where the Jews on campus are more Orthodox, those services are Orthodox. Where Reform, the services are Reform. And on campuses with large, diverse Jewish populations, usually the ones in New York, they run the gamut. So they are a non-ideological service provider, basically, who aim broadly to increase Jewish involvement and identification on college campuses. They host all sorts of events from all sorts of perspectives with very few red lines. But there are some red lines. For instance, Hillel houses will not host Christian missionaries. They will also not host groups like BDS, which attack and challenge the state of Israel's existence or undermine its basic right to exist. This last limitation about BDS and similar anti-Israel organizations caused some liberal Jews who think defaming and boycotting Israel is a positive expression of their Jewishness to break away from Hillel and make something called Open Hillel, where people who are Jewish, and those who are not also, can express basically literally any opinion about Jewishly related sorts of things without any organizational oversight. Now, I'm sure you can tell where I stand on this by how I presented the issue, but I want to talk about why these positions are over the line as opinions to be officially represented at a Jewish organization, not just a Zionist organization, but a Jewish one. For one thing, there is an obvious practical reason, which is that Hillel is a privately funded organization, and the older generation of Jews who pay for it don't want to be bankrolling the enemies of Israel and the Jewish people. If Hillel allows these positions to have the stage at their events, these donors will pull their funding and Hillel will cease to exist, or at least cease to be able to fund the sorts of programs they would like to. But if we were to take an idealized version of Hillel, in a thought experiment, let's say, which existed without any outside funding, perhaps with a massive endowment, let's say, then we could really address the issue, which is what opinions are out of bounds in a Jewish context, especially in a pluralistic Jewish context like Hillel that aims to include Jews of all stripes, Orthodox, Reform, secular, vaguely associated with Judaism in an ethnic lox and bagels kind of way. Between all those groups, really, what is the common theme they agree on? Why should they be in one big tent to begin with? What's the tent? We don't agree on the basic tenets of our religion, all those different groups. And I would argue we actually represent more than one religion, which are all referred to as Judaism. We don't agree on politics. Some of us conservative, others liberal, some Zionist, some not. What we're left with at the end of the day is Jewish peoplehood. This idea that with or without the state of Israel, the Jewish people is a nation, a people, an ethnic group of some sort. Now, since this is an ethnicity, which one can convert to, I don't think describing Jews as an ethnicity is actually very descriptive. People usually think of ethnicity as something people have to be born into. We're more of a tribal nation like the Sioux or the Cherokee. We're a nation with a shared past, with some sort of shared belief system, at least on some level. But there is also a technical process for joining, no matter what color your skin is, what food you're used to, or what language you speak. In the early 20th century, most Jews were opposed to Zionism, what today we would call the ultra-Orthodox, and the Reform movement for theological reasons, and most other Jews for practical, self-interested reasons, that they were afraid their loyalty would be called into question in the states they lived in if a Jewish state came into existence. After the Holocaust, almost all of these groups came around, with the exception of some ultra-Orthodox groups, as they had seen that there was indeed no safe place for Jews who could not defend themselves if the most enlightened country with the most assimilated Jewish population in the world could become enthralled to Hitler and Nazism. And after the state was established, the state of Israel, most ultra-Orthodox Jews came to support it as a fait accompli. That is, they wouldn't have wanted it to be established, but now that it's there, they recognize it's better than any alternative that's available and at least passively support it. And that has been the idea for most of the time since 1948. Most Jews support Israel as necessary and as important, regardless of any ideological or policy disagreements they may have. The understanding that, like it or not, this is the largest concentration of Jews in the world, and that Israel still lives in a precarious and dangerous situation, has put certain limits on the outline of the debate about it inside Jewish circles. Jews have argued that both sides, always the other side, from whoever they are, in Israel's politics are horrible fascists, murderers, capitalists, communists, warmongers, etc. But there's never been an attempt to delegitimize the state's existence or to punish the country as a whole for one or the other policy of the government coming from within the Jewish community. Up until now, we've always kept this balance where we recognize how essential Israel is to our continued national existence. Again, like it or not, regardless of our strong disagreement with its policies. But today, there is a generation of young people who don't have any real understanding of how dangerous the world is or how precarious Israel's position is. They don't remember, or perhaps even know, about 1967 and 1973, when Israel was on the brink of destruction. They don't remember Israel giving back a chunk of land double the size of the country for peace with Egypt. And they see us as eternal warmongers. They get their news about Israel from the same liberal outlets in the US where they get news about other subjects. But unfortunately, left-leaning news in the US and elsewhere, regardless of the good they might do in other areas, has completely missed the boat on Israel and continuously misrepresents one-sided and damning critiques of the Jewish state. Unfortunately, many young Jews have decided that the problems Israel has, real or perceived, negate its right to exist. They side with organizations whose purpose is to delegitimize Israel in the eyes of the world, to damage its economy, to push forward the case of our enemies who support blowing up buses full of civilians, not as collateral damage in a defensive war, but as an intentional target in an offensive campaign. Or they're useful idiots for these causes who don't really pay attention to those sort of murderous, quasi-genocidal intentions and only listen to the blathering about human rights, which covers up for those intentions. If you support organizations which are so anti-Israel that they support murdering innocent Jews just because they're Israeli, you are outside the tent. If you support an organization which only thinly veils its hatred of the Jewish state as a whole, like BDS, which is actually one of the more moderate of the groups that were quote-unquote banned, and couches its venom in the language of occupation and human rights while actively pushing the position of terrorists and anti-Semites who mean the entire country of Israel when they refer to the occupation, then you are outside the tent, whether you are just a useful idiot or genuinely siding with them. There's plenty of criticism to go around. Israel is a country, and it makes mistakes and has problems. In some ways, our politics is dysfunctional, though I would argue that our democracy might function a lot better than the one in the United States does in terms of representing the positions of the public and making substantive decisions when the people want them. But there is a line between criticizing your own people, or this most large group of them who happen to be Israeli, from the inside as a friend, as a family member, and joining the raucous chorus of Jew-hating, Jew-murdering terrorists and their mostly anti-democratic supporters who would mostly prefer there be no women's liberation in this piece of land, and no gay rights, and no Jews, and no freedom of speech, but would rather we turn the country over to the Palestinians to let them impose their despotic form of government over the population here. There is a difference between taking part in a Jewish debate about who we should be as a people and what the decisions of Israel's government mean to us, and joining the majority of the world's despots and anti-Semites in condemning the Jewish state on the world stage. those organizations should be banned from a Jewish context. They should be put outside the realm of reasonable discourse inside the big tent of Jewish dialogue. There's no shortage of places where they can go and have their opinions heard. And people who support them actively should not be welcome in any context which claims to represent or serve the Jewish community. And Hillel, the Jewish organization which is supposed to help connect Jews to Judaism and Jewish identity, has absolutely no interest in becoming yet another place where the very existence of Israel is a point of contention. The insulting and hypocritical question of whether Israel has a right to exist should not be up for grabs in this context. There should be one place where young Jews can come on campus and not be confronted by BDS and other Israel-hating propaganda. I applaud Hillel for not, so far, caving into the demands of the Open Hillel crowd. Keep up the good work. Thanks for listening to that. I feel strongly that any community worth maintaining is going to have boundaries, entrance requirements, an inside and an outside. Up until now, we were talking about a political boundary within Jewish institutions in North America. The next section of the podcast is going to dig into a similar issue in Israel that touches on educational, political, and religious boundaries, and what the prerogatives of government are in enforcing them in the context of a Jewish state. Late last year, in 2015, the Education Ministry made a decision, which may seem unimportant, and that's because it is. It didn't decide to ban a book. It did not decide whether people who read this book would be punished. It did not decide whether students who bring this book into the classroom and share it with friends and write book reports about it should be penalized in some way. They decided whether the book Border Life by Dorit Rabinyan should be included in the list of approved books that teachers can choose to require their students to read as part of the high school curriculum. Now, this set off a firestorm of criticism. So why was the book excluded, and why are people so upset about it? One of the strong voices denouncing the decision just this week in a Times of Israel blog post is David Sarna. He wrote, "The book, which was released in 2014 and won the 2015 Bernstein Prize for Literature, tells the story of an ill-fated romance between a Palestinian man and Jewish Israeli woman." He goes on to quote that, "Intimate relations between Jews and non-Jews," wrote Dalia Fenig, the official who heads the committee responsible for the disqualification, "are seen by large portions of society as a threat on the separate identities of Arabs and Jews." He, Sarna, then asserts, without quotation, but I guess as his opinion of what Naftali Bennett's opinion is, that Naftali Bennett upheld the decision based on the argument that Israeli high school students couldn't handle the message of the book. They would read it as a call to go out and have sex with Arabs. The ministry's reaction suggests that its experts have a kindergarten-level understanding of literature. There's a big difference between a novel and a cookbook. Fiction is first and foremost fictitious. Even the youngest of children doesn't jump out of a window after reading Peter Pan. So I'm going to move past how silly this particular objection is to include in an article which goes on to advocate for Jews and Arabs, or rather Arab non-Jews, having romantic relationships together. A sort of, it's not true that this book will cause this, but I wish it would and it should, and I'm going to try to make it happen. But I want to get to the heart of the issue, which Sarna notably doesn't really focus on in his article so much. One part of the issue is free speech, which is what many on the left are attacking the government over. I have to point out, again, that this is simply not a free speech issue. The Education Ministry puts out lists of books which it feels are both worthy on a literary level and educationally positive to include on the list of books to be taught to its students. The fact that some people wanted to include the book on this list and that the government chose not to is not censorship. It's like if certain people want to invite a speaker to a certain forum and the forum decides not to, it may be a bad decision. It may be stupid. It might have been good to have that voice represented, or it might not. But it's not a freedom of speech issue. They are still free to give their speech in the public park, on YouTube, or at any other event where they are invited. The state is not suppressing their views. The supporters of this book are free to set up stands on the street and hand out copies to high school students if they want to. So just to be clear, there is absolutely no free speech issue here whatsoever. And any assertions to the contrary are somewhat ridiculous on the face of it. But then the issue is about education and values. As I quoted before, Sarna completely rejects any connection between teaching about something and encouraging students to do that thing. As he said, fiction is first and foremost fictitious. Even the youngest of children doesn't jump out of a window after reading Peter Pan. Yeah, that's true. People don't tend to think they have magical powers after reading about characters that do, except, for a few crazy people here and there. But this isn't about the bounds of reality. This is about educating children with certain values. I completely respect people making an argument that this is a value that should be included in Israeli schools, although I disagree, who say that we should encourage romance between Jews and non-Jewish Arabs as a way of increasing ties of love and friendship between our two peoples. Again, I disagree, and I disagree very strongly, but that's an argument over values. The assertion that Sarna is making is more insidious. He's implying that values are simply not transmitted through what we teach our children. This would imply that giving our children books in which women or homosexuals are denigrated as subhuman, or in which characters that hold those views are represented sympathetically, and having it taught in the classroom will not affect the views of kids on those issues. I'm sure Sarna, who happens to be gay, would disagree if I were to put it that way. In the episode about intermarriage, I discussed how and why relationships between Jews and non-Jews are a boundary issue for Judaism. It's one of the things that is just clearly and completely outside the bounds of any traditional view of Judaism. And in a country which values both its religious tradition and its national identity, encouraging these relationships is a non-starter. As it happens, it's also a non-starter from the Arab side. This whole discussion is about the Hebrew curriculum taught in mostly Jewish schools. The Arab-speaking schools would never even consider such a book for inclusion in the first place. It would have been rejected out of hand in the earliest stage of the vetting process. Now, I would wager that we would mostly agree that a nation's school system has the right, if not the duty, to avoid teaching values to its students which the society abhors. But then I hear you all saying, and I agree, that's true unless the value of that society is abhorrent. So let's come back to the moral issue about relationships between Jews and non-Jewish Arabs. First, why do I keep saying non-Jewish Arabs instead of just Arabs? So that takes a little bit of explanation. Before 1948, and for a while after, Jews who lived in Arabic-speaking lands were often referred to as Arab Jews. Being Arab is no more about your genetic code than being Jewish is. Most of the people in Arab countries today are either not at all, or at least largely not descended from people from the Arabian Peninsula. But they're united by the language of Arabic and by some level of common culture. People who were part of that culture, but were Jewish, were referred to as Arab Jews. As far as most Israelis are concerned, a person who converts to Judaism would be welcome to date their children, even if their parents named them Muhammad. This isn't a racial issue, it's a religious and national issue, and they're intertwined. Israel is locked in a life and death struggle with much of the Arab and Muslim worlds, and deals with simmering hostility under the surface of peace agreements with the rest. So there is certainly, on one hand, a sense of sleeping with the enemy here. But more importantly for Israelis, and at least most Israelis, and certainly those who are religious, is that interfaith relationships lead to interfaith marriages, which lead to assimilation. In my wife's segment on the intermarriage episode, the letter to Joseph there, she talked about the myriad reasons why, in addition to a religious prohibition, Jews don't like intermarriage. It has to do with worldview, with life goals, and with the survival of this astonishing group of people who we don't want to see diluted out of existence, which is one inevitable result, culturally, of large numbers of interfaith marriages, especially when they follow one after another, generation after generation. The best any reasonable person can ask, given these facts, for the state of Israel is for the state of the Jews to be tolerant of such couples, which, in fact, we are. The state does not persecute interfaith couples. They're allowed to live. They're allowed to buy apartments. They're allowed to file taxes as married couples. But to insist that we must teach about such relationships and normalize them as trivial or even desirable in the literature that we teach to our children is tilting at windmills. And I, for one, am rooting for the windmills. That's all for this week's episode of Jewish Geography. If you like the show, please go to rabbieitan.com, that's RABBIEITAN.com, and check out past episodes, subscribe, or feel free to be in touch. You can also learn there about taking a tour with me on your next visit to Israel, which I hope will be soon. I'll be back next Tuesday with another episode. In the meantime, be well and God bless.